Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome, listeners, to the Aurora Energy Unplugged podcast. I'm your host. My name is Ryan Alexander. I head up the Pan-European Power Markets team at Aurora Energy Research, based here in Berlin. And I'm really happy to be joined by two special guests, which also coincidentally happen to be members of my team and the product leads in my team. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Anuoluwa Omojola. Anu is based out of our Oxford office. She's worked in various roles, including our Great Britain advisory team and research teams. She currently is the product lead for flexibility in the team and is the author of Aurora's hit reports on battery markets attractiveness in Europe. Welcome, Anu, to the podcast.
Great to be here. Thanks, Ryan.
I'm also joined by Rebecca McManus. Becca is the inaugural research lead for Ireland for our Irish power market product. She's also been with the company now for almost 6 years, is really a veteran in the space, and has most recently joined the team to focus on our pan-European renewables analysis. And Becca has spent quite a lot of time recently authoring our inaugural European offshore wind markets attractiveness report. So Becca, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ryan. Should be a really interesting discussion.
So guys, let's jump into it. The topic for today is around what markets are hot in Europe right now. And that's a very big question, but there's lots of interesting developments happening in the past few weeks that I would like us to touch on. So Becca, just turning to you, what is most exciting or surprising for you about energy markets in Europe right now? Which markets are attracting your attention?
Yeah, really good question. And I mean, I think it really depends on the technology that you're talking about. So I guess in the offshore wind space, we see a few hot markets at the moment, primarily those that we've seen have a good track record to date. So the likes of GB and Germany, for example. I think when it comes to solar, though, probably a bit more surprising on some of the markets that we see come out on top. So obviously, we've got Spain and Italy ranking quite highly across Europe for solar, but I think which will be especially surprising for some of the Germans that endure those long grey winters, that actually solar in Germany seems to actually top the rankings for us when we're looking at solar markets in particular.
Okay, and let's take that then, Becca, one by one. So on offshore wind, you mentioned that Great Britain is topping, at least in our view, according to our analysis, the list of European markets. But we also just heard in the news that Vattenfall has pulled out of one of their sizable offshore wind projects in the country. So, I mean, how does that make sense? What, like, if there are companies pulling out of projects that we understood to be contracted, then what does that say about the market?
Yeah, no, really, really good questions. I think it's kind of worth unpacking kind of, I guess, why the project in particular has pulled out and why we still see that GB is a market to look out for in the offshore wind space. I think just focusing on the kind of first part of that question. So I think we last year saw the very, very extreme low prices in the GB CFD subsidy support auction. So clearing at around £37. So what is that in today's money? Around £45 per megawatt hour. So we saw the prices clear very, very low. And I guess what have we seen over the last 12 months? So we've seen increase in input costs. So turbine prices increasing quite substantially. So Siemens turbines increasing by 16% over the last year. On top of that, we've seen increases in cost of capital and inflation. So interest rates increasing quite substantially. So driving up those financing costs. So all in all, I guess that's kind of why we've seen the kind of project economics not stacking up at this moment in time. And I think actually even Vattenfall itself said costs were increasing actually even more than what I previously just quoted. So I think that's why we've seen the project pull out at this stage. But I don't think it's all doom and gloom. Obviously, GB have a great track record of bringing on offshore wind to date. And moving forward, it does have kind of strong policy and government ambition to increase that even further. So with targets in 2030 to reach 50 gigawatts, I think that's quite good to see within a particular market. And whilst we've seen, obviously, with the costs and financing over the last year, not kind of go in offshore wind's favour, I think what we'll see moving forward is increased policy support to actually make sure that they're able to reach those ambitious targets by 2030.
So let me ask a silly question, perhaps, Becca. But you mentioned that like increases in costs and also the cost of capital has been what has tanked that project. But then why can't the GB government just implement indexation for the price of the CFD contracts? Because this is something we see in other markets, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think this is definitely something we're seeing happen more and more often. So, for example, if we looked into the Irish market in particular, with the onshore wind and solar subsidy support auctions in Ireland, for those technologies, prices were not index linked. But however, with the feedback from participants within the market, we've seen that actually the first offshore wind auction, actually there was price indexation as part of that. And I think through the next rounds of the solar and onshore wind only auctions, we'll also see them moving down a kind of similar route. And that also was in response to some similar impacts that happened within the subsidy support schemes over there, which is participants were kind of bidding in at these lower levels, and then we've seen the changes to prices and costs, and then subsequently seen more projects pull out. So I think in response to what we've seen over the recent years in terms of those interest rates, inflation and cost changes, we'll probably see governments tending to more towards introducing those particular policy points.
So let me just pick up on that subsidy point again, Becca, that you mentioned. So in the European power market reform discussions, we saw the Commission coming out with this proposal to make two-way contracts for difference, or CFDs, mandatory across member states. We've also seen in the past week one of the committees of the European Parliament come out and effectively propose to roll that back. So effectively saying, let's maintain something closer to the status quo. I mean, what's going on there? And also, standing in the shoes of a developer, what sense do you make of this discussion?
Yeah, no, really, really interesting. I mean, I think this is bringing up another kind of key risk within the market, not only just the offshore wind market, but renewables in general, which is kind of that policy uncertainty point, which in order to kind of get investors investing in these projects, you kind of need this kind of certainty in terms of policy and where we see policy moving forward, because it just increases the amount of risk that's kind of there in terms of investing in these type of projects. So I think in terms of what the impacts of that could be, I suppose across Europe, we do see that certain member states adopt different forms of subsidy support, so not the kind of two-way CFDs that we see in GB, and we're just discussing. So we see these as kind of a floating premium one-way CFD type of contracts. So obviously, with the move away from that, the likes of Germany, for example, would have to adopt kind of a new subsidy support mechanism similar to kind of the GB format moving forward. But in terms of just even looking at it from a kind of GB perspective, although everyone's moving to kind of adopt the GB two-way CFD method and policy, actually GB is already thinking of what's next beyond the two-way CFD, whether or not actually the CFD for mature technologies is actually the policy format that's kind of required moving forward, whether or not it actually still makes sense. So whilst I think the kind of shift and kind of backtracking on the mandatory two-way CFD, I think actually it's more recognizing the particular quirks of each of the individual markets and how mature the technologies are within each of the different regions.
Well, that's throwing a spanner into the works, Becca, but I think it's indeed a great question, which is, well, maybe actually two-way CFDs are old school here, and maybe there is a new innovation that hasn't been considered there. But I think that clarity is not yet there in the European proposal. So let's wait and see. And one more point I want to bring up, Becca, is this point regarding PPAs. So the European Commission placed a lot of emphasis on the PPA market as a way to maintain or increase momentum in investment into renewables in Europe. And I mean, personally, I found it quite interesting how they were promoting CFDs for subsidies, PPAs for market-based mechanisms. Not really clear how those two complement each other in practice. What do you think, and what examples have you seen about how that reform might look in practice in the future?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we commented on the fact that potentially CFDs aren't the way forward for these kind of mature technologies. So it's thinking about what future financing models should we look to. And I guess the most recent example, and it's definitely been in the news and quoted quite substantially our renewables conference for sure in London, is the Moray West project, the ocean wind project, which saw a combination of corporate PPAs, but also CFDs. So I think it was at least around 52% of the generation was contracted under a corporate PPA, whilst the kind of rest of the capacity was under a CFD. And I guess the kind of benefits of this hybrid approach is the ability to unlock kind of more revenue streams under that, and kind of build a revenue stack to combine not only kind of the CFD element, but the corporate PPA element, which allows additional revenue streams as part of that.
Very interesting. And that is then potentially a great sign of things to come if even absent the European Commission's reform proposal, this is something that in principle can work across different markets, but certainly we might see that pick up more momentum in different markets as that reform trickles down to the member state level. Let's move on to talk about flex for a second, and particularly batteries. So Anu, you have been leading our analysis on battery flexibility markets for batteries and other types of flex services across Europe. So what's attracted your attention in the past few weeks in Europe? Which market has been attracting your attention and why?
I mean, across Europe, there's been, a lot of interest in batteries recently. So I would say in general, the whole of Europe is quite hot for batteries right now. But me personally, I think I'm quite interested in Greece, just as a market for battery storage, which to many might be surprising. But over the past year, say 12, 18 months, there's been a lot of movement in Greece, and we see policy moving quite fast, which is surprising for Europe. I mean, historically, how things have played out. But we've seen Greece, announce an energy storage target of about 6 gigawatts by 2030, which shows firm commitment by the government, to deploying this capacity. And also to back that up, they've announced a fund of over 300 million euros as well to procure some of that capacity. Because typically, with these things, we have government setting targets, but without putting, money where the mouth is, as is to say. So we've seen that. And then also more importantly, they've also liberalized the frequency markets in Greece, opening up, more revenue streams for batteries. It essentially builds that business case. So, there's 3 key factors. You have strong support from governments. You also have, expansion opportunities, and you have, quite a solid business case, which can be built in Greece at the moment.
And let me dive into that a little bit further, Anu. I mean, there are plenty of other markets in Europe which have deregulated their frequency and ancillary services balancing type markets in the past. What makes Greece so special in your eyes here?
A key point here that I'll make is just that time is money. So we have all these other markets across Europe that have also been liberalized, and we can talk about this a bit more later as well. We see them starting to get saturated. The exciting thing about Greece at this moment is that the market is fresh, and so early movers will have that advantage of capturing, high revenues before you have a lot more capacity coming onto the system, and that market getting a bit saturated and seeing those revenues decline.
Okay, super interesting. And yes, as they say, early bird gets the worm, and that is the case in a market like that, so it seems. You touched on this point about saturation of balancing frequency markets. Now, from what we see, from what you've seen, this is happening, and it seems to be inevitable, right? As you set the rules for batteries, you get more battery capacity into the system. The prices of those services come down because there's more supply in the ancillary supply stack. So, if you stand in the shoes of a developer, what do you do about this, and how do you tackle this problem?
Good question. And this actually is a very common question we get from developers and investors alike, because we see the saturation happening. Like you said, it's inevitable. But here I will introduce a concept which I think is crucial, for battery business cases, which essentially is revenue stacking. So, I mean, some of us might be familiar with this, but essentially, gathering as much revenues as you can from across different markets. So we'll see, the frequency market saturate as we have more capacity coming on the system. But then we can think of that in two ways. So one, we see the revenues decrease because the market is more saturated. But as we see the system evolve with more renewables coming on the system, we expect to see higher volumes or higher requirements for these frequency services. So even though you're losing in terms of the absolute price that you get, you're also gaining in terms of volume, how much you're dispatching in those services. So that tends to, balance out in a sense. And then we start to stack revenues on top of that. So depending on the country, because, different revenue streams and markets are available across the different countries in Europe, you could also stack on that, a capacity market payment, even though that doesn't make up much of your revenue stack, but you get some revenues from that. You also stack on, revenues from energy arbitrage, and that could be in the wholesale market, looking at intraday markets or day ahead markets, and also stacking from a balancing market, for example, in the UK and Ireland. So, stacking all those revenues will be essential for building a profitable business case just as we move into the future. And that essentially helps, to work against the cannibalization of those revenues.
So let me ask a curveball question, Anu. You're a developer of grid-scale batteries. What about behind the meter? Because there are some pretty big volumes we're seeing coming into different markets. In which markets would this be a concern, and maybe more of a concern than other markets?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, we see competition for grid-scale batteries across all markets, coming from different angles, but particularly thinking about behind the meter. Now, I mean, when I think about flexibility, I think there's a role for multiple different technologies and forms of storage, because if we think about, the future that we're going towards, we have an increasing need for flexibility. So there'll be a role for grid-scale storage, there'll be a role for, longer duration storage, as well as behind the meter storage. But particularly in terms of the competition from behind the meter storage, I think Germany is one region where that is a huge concern, or where there's, that high level of competition. One, because if we look at Germany historically, about 70-80% of the capacity of the storage capacity that has come online has been behind the meter. And this has mainly been because of, the business case. So for the business case for behind the meter assets in Germany have typically been more profitable than grid scale assets. And this is, one key driver is because they have exposure to retail prices, which are higher versus, grid scale assets that see wholesale prices. Also because the frequency markets haven't been as lucrative for these grid scale assets in the past. But looking forward, we're seeing more opportunities for grid scale assets. The government, there's a lot more support for that as we're recognizing, the increasing need for these assets to kind of stabilize the grid and provide that flexibility that you need, not just behind the meter, but also in front of the meter. So while that has historically been, a huge form of competition, expect that grid scale would see a lot more deployment of grid scale assets in Germany going forward.
Okay, super interesting. Thanks, Anu. I want to turn to another topic which has got everyone's attention across Europe for different reasons, which is permitting. And it is a dry topic, but it is one of those key constraints facing developers in almost every market in some shape or form. So, Becca, the European Commission went out very, very loudly last year announcing some new timelines for projects to adhere to in order to secure development approvals in member states. But, the devil's in the detail, right? And I'm curious, where do we see member states responding to what the Commission has requested, and where do we see those movements happening?
Yeah, so I think the EU as a whole has passed significant regulation in terms of introducing and accelerating the permitting processes. But I think across Europe, we've also seen individual countries introduce particular regulation to actually speed up this as well. And I guess just to point to a few regions across Europe. So in Italy, for example, we've seen significant introduction in policy there, which is likely to speed up permitting processes for solar in particular, but also in France and in Greece as well.
And just to understand, Becca, when we talk about permitting improvements, like what practically are we talking about in some of those markets, and like how effective is that looking?
Yeah, so I think in particular of what some countries are trying to do. So, for example, in Greece, the kind of new regulation that they've introduced is to kind of reduce the licensing time for renewables quite significantly. So from 5 years previously to 14 months. So hopefully this will increase and accelerate the rates at which we're seeing permitting in Greece, for example. But also in other regions, it's kind of simplifying the processes or setting out particular zones or standards that will help accelerate the environmental authorization of some of the projects within these individual regions.
Okay, so all of the talk at the European Commission level is actually starting to be backed up by concrete developments at the member state level, which is great to see.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not just limited to solar as well. We're seeing similar trends in kind of the offshore wind space as well. Introductions of permitting processes and simplifying those processes in order to allow projects to get their kind of seabed leases and planning approved at much faster timescales.
And just touching on that, Becca, is there a particular market there in terms of offshore wind that has caught your eye where those permitting and development processes are actually having an effect on the pipeline?
Yeah, so I suppose, we've spoken about GB in quite a lot of detail, but obviously GB has quite a robust procedure in terms of receiving your kind of seabed lease, in the fact that you essentially have to endure a competitive seabed leasing auction before you're even able to participate in the subsidy auctions in GB. And it's great that identifying these particular areas for offshore wind projects to come through. However, we're seeing huge projects come through the kind of seabed leasing rounds, and it's whether or not we'll see these projects moving forward or coming through in the subsequent auction rounds. So I guess there's kind of questions there on what's the best approach in terms of seabed leases. And across Europe, we see this vary quite substantially from non-competitive processes where projects are simply awarded their kind of seabed leases, but also what we see in some regions is actually a combination of your seabed lease as part of your auction support tender as well. So combining the two together, which kind of has its benefits in terms of at least once you've gained that subsidy support, you've also got the seabed lease, whereas the kind of way the GB auction currently is formatted is that you'll get your seabed lease and it's unclear whether or not you'll actually get a subsidy support contract after that.
Interesting. And also we saw that the German government announced the results of their latest seabed auction in the past couple of weeks, and that has generated whopping over €1 billion in revenues for the state, but it's also €1 billion of costs that developers had to incur in that seabed leasing auction. So it seems like the costs are increasing across the board for developers in Europe. I guess the question we'll find out is whether the subsidy support schemes in Europe are going to continue to innovate to support developers to bring those projects to market. So one topic I want to bring up before the end of this podcast is a hot topic on, I think, many people's lips, and that is co-location. So the concept, I think, is clear. It's about pairing up a renewable asset with a battery or a hydrogen electrolyzer and being able to make the most of those synergies. So, Anu, I want to ask you a question about where this is making more sense. Where do you see this taking off? And what are the conditions that are making this more attractive in some markets rather than others?
Great question, Ryan. This is actually a very hot topic now. I feel like every conversation I have these days, co-location comes up. One, mainly because it's it's linked closely, to the future of battery storage development and renewables as well. So yeah, why co-location? It's, attractive across most of Europe, basically everywhere where you have good resources, right? And good economics, but some specific regions come to mind. So if we think about the distribution of resources, we look at Iberia, for example. So in Iberia, you have, huge solar resource. We have huge build out of solar capacity already. And we're also seeing a lot more, strides being taken in terms of battery storage. So we already see just last month, the Spanish government updated their targets, increasing the solar capacity that they're targeting and also targeting now over 20 gigawatts of storage in Spain. So a lot of that will come on, either as standalone or as co-located assets. So if you think about, we have the resources already. You have solar, you have support from government in that region. Also think about the economics of it. So solar profiles are quite complementary, with battery storage. So we see a lot of projects already in Europe being developed in that region. So we see really good economics from that because the project is able to benefit from, high energy arbitrage revenues, as well as also participate in frequency markets. So once again, the concept of revenue stacking comes into play, making these projects quite lucrative for developers.
And can I just check on something there, Anu? Because a lot of the factors you mentioned are rather market related in terms of why the availability of solar resources and the deployment of solar in Iberia makes a compelling case for some co-location opportunities. But there's also something funny there whereby if you have a co-located project, you either advance in the connection process or you are eligible for some kind of subsidy in auctions that you wouldn't otherwise be. What's going on there?
Yes, so that's another very important point in Iberia. So one, you see more favorable regulation for co-located projects. Basically, the government and TSOs are trying to encourage more of these projects. So as a co-located project, you get some preference in terms of the permitting process. So for retrofits, for example, you have a much more simplified permitting process, making it quite easy for your project to come online. Also, in the new auctions that have been announced, hybrid, also known as co-located projects, get extra points for being co-located. So essentially, if you're a res asset, you get extra points in the auction because it's points based, and obviously the more points you get, the better chances you are. So you get more points for being co-located with a storage asset. So that also signifies, the strong support that we're seeing from the policy and regulation side of things that's driving co-located projects in that region.
Super interesting. And so again, we find in the power markets that developments are as much and sometimes, if not more, a product of regulation as they are of market forces. Where do you think, Anu, that you are going to see this pop up next? And, given that there are some regulatory and market drivers for this, do you have any hot tips for our listeners?
Yeah, I would say Italy as well would be a hot market for co-location, and also the UK. So the UK obviously is a more mature, established market across Europe. We have almost half of the total installed capacity, and there are already a few co-located projects. But something exciting happened last week where we saw a PPA being signed, first PPA that was signed for a co-located hybrid project. And one key question or one key concern for developers and investors is kind of that long-term contractability that you get for batteries. So, seeing that PPA being signed and delivered in the UK, I think is a really good sign. One, providing that confidence and that long-term security of revenues that we need for batteries, and also just showing, that there's more to come in terms of co-located projects.
Well, that was a great discussion, and I think we managed to unpack a lot of the different developments happening in Europe in recent weeks and try and link them to some of the emerging signals for what markets are attractive for different reasons and different investments in Europe. So thanks very much, Anu. It was great to have you here.
Thanks, Ryan. Always a pleasure to talk about batteries.
That's great to hear, Anu. Becca, thanks for joining. I hope it's just as enjoyable for you to talk about renewables.
Of course, Ryan. Always a pleasure.
And that's not because Becca's in my team, but she genuinely believes it. Thanks everyone for listening, and see you next time.
That was Ryan Alexander, who heads up the Pan-European Power Markets team at Aurora, talking to two other members of the team, Anuoluwa Omojola, Product Lead for Flexibility, and Rebecca McManus, Renewables Lead. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening and goodbye.